So what I wanted to talk about tonight was the history of nonviolence in the Christian faith, and especially nonviolent resistance. Because I am convinced, and I'm totally open to being corrected on this point. If anybody has any evidence to the contrary, I'm totally open to it. But as near as I can tell, the first person in history to come up with the concept of nonviolent resistance was Jesus of Nazareth. I cannot find earlier teachings on the concept of nonviolent resistance. And so when we think about like the work of people like Gandhi, the work of people like Dr. King, that sort of way that you resist oppression and evil, but do so without resorting to violence, I think Jesus came up with that. And that to me is really cool and really interesting. And so that's sort of, and I guess the third reason why I wanted to do this particular Bible study is most of the material that we're going to be looking at tonight comes from the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, which is that first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. And if you've been coming to church, you'll know that that's where we're at in the lectionary. We just did the Beatitudes. We're going to hear about how you are salt and light this Sunday. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount in church on Sunday mornings. That's where the lectionary is taking us. So you'll get to dive a little bit more deeply into some of these texts that we're also going to hear on Sunday morning in the next few weeks. So that's actually where we are. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Maybe can we go around in a circle and just hear from everybody? Like, how are you all feeling about this as a Bible study topic?
It's interesting. Why not?
Why not? I love the attitude.
Yeah, well, early 1500s, 1671, my ancestors, Swiss Germans, they were in Switzerland. And finally, 1671, they were all gone, or they were dead. And it's about 500 years ago, and it was about 2006 that the city of Bern actually sent a letter asking for forgiveness for all the killings and persecution that was done almost 500 years ago. So I thought that was interesting. But they would not join the Quakers, the Amish, the Mennonites. They would not join the army, the military.
Right.
And so the government was upset because they rented out a lot of army groups. Like even the Swiss Guard that guarded the French royalty, and then the Guard all died during the Revolution there. So.
Yeah, and just so you are aware of the term, that umbrella group of Quakers and Mennonites, those folks are collectively referred to as Anabaptists. That was sort of a major movement.
Anti-Baptist?
A-N-A. Anabaptists. And that was a Christian restoration movement that was trying to get back to the roots of the early church. And that was one element of their particular aspect of the Reformation, was that commitment to nonviolence. What do you think, Joe? How do you feel about this? You've read the book. All right. I wasn't sure how you'd react to this. A lot of this stuff is based out of a book called The Powers That Be by Walter Wink, and I was 99% sure that I had lent Joe a copy of that book a couple of years ago, so this will not be news to you. What do you all think?
I think it's very relevant to me. You can't watch news without some bit of conflict, either just domestic or foreign. So,
Sure.
And I guess kind of like we said, the Revelations 1, there's always empires, there's always someone, there's always something to be fought, and
right.
That's the best way to fight it.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good connection there with the Revelation, right? There's always empire, there's always oppressor. How do Christians stand up to that? I hope that's the question we answer tonight. All right, cool. So that's where we're going to start then. Like I said, most of this material comes from the Sermon on the Mount, so we are going to start in the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. So you'll remember this from this Sunday, right? The Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. But I want to focus in specifically on Matthew 5:5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So if you think about that word meek, what does that word conjure up for you?
It's kind of used kind of like timid or shy or you can be passive.
Timid, passive. Other thoughts? Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a fair association, right? When we think of the word meek as we use it today in our English language, timid, shy, passive, somebody who is
Not aggressive in any way.
not aggressive in any way. Yeah. And very often when we have looked at this passage, I think that a lot of Christians using sort of that modern English understanding of the word meekness think that that's what we are being called to be shy, to be timid, to be passive. What is often overlooked in this passage, so the Greek word that is being translated to meek is praus. Praus. That's the Greek word there, praus. And you can certainly translate it to meek. It's not a bad definition of the word. But here is the problem with just rendering it meek and leaving it there for our modern English audience, is that you might not be aware of the history of that word in Greek, praus. So is anybody familiar with Aristotelian ethics? So Aristotle taught that ethics was basically what you want to have are virtues. And virtues were the middle ground between vices of excess and deficiency. You have too much of something or too little of something. So for example, courage is a virtue that lies between the extreme excess of foolhardiness, right, where you don't consider any risks or any consequences of your actions, and the vice of deficiency, which would be cowardice, right? There is such a thing as too much courage, too much bravery, where you just do stupid things and put yourself in dangerous situations, but there's also a thing as having too little, right? You're a coward, you're somebody who doesn't act. In the same way, for another example, generosity for Aristotle was a virtue that lies between the excess, which would be wastefulness, just throwing your money away on stupid things that don't matter, and miserliness, right? Being a total penny pincher hoarder that never does anything beneficial or joyful with your money. Historically speaking, this is the part that's often overlooked when we just read that word meek in our English language. Historically speaking, the Greek word praus was Aristotle's word for the virtue that lies between apathy and anger, right? So being excessively angry, where you just flip out over every little thing, somebody cuts you off in traffic and so you lay on your horn and you decide that you'll go out of your way to ride their bumper for 1.5 miles just to make sure that they know how upset you are, right? That's the excess of anger, right? Any little thing you fly off the handle. But there's also a deficiency, which is apathy, right? You don't care about anything. Somebody burns your house down and you're just like, oh, I wish you hadn't done that. Right? Praus is that virtue that lies in between. So praus, historically, to Greek-speaking people, to the people who would have read this gospel when it was first written, had this extra significance. It meant being in that sweet spot between being angry and being apathetic. It means being angry for the right reason, at the right person, in the right way, at the right time, for the right amount of time, right? It was just exactly the right amount of anger, right? You think about Goldilocks, right? Too hard, too soft, just right, right? It's anger that's just right. It's not flying off the handle for no good reason, but it's also not having no anger at all. Contrast that with how we use the word meek today, right? So especially when I like that word to use passive, right? Prose is not passive. It involves being angry for the right reason, at the right person, at the right time. It's the sweet spot of anger. So, at least as far as Matthew 5:5 goes, we are not being called as Christians to be doormats. But let's keep going with this. We're going to jump ahead to Matthew 5:38 and 39. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. I'm going to stop there. No, I'm actually going to read this whole paragraph. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. So, do not resist an evildoer. Does that sound like Jesus to you? Have y'all seen the cartoon on my office door? Have y'all seen this? I'm going to grab something real quick. I got props. So I have this has been hanging on my door for years, since before that door was my door. This was hanging up in Escalon before I came to Custer. But I just get a kick out of it. So it's a Michelangelo fresco. Like, this is like good Renaissance era painting. But the caption says, if anyone ever asks you what would Jesus do, remind him that flipping over tables and chasing people with a whip is within the realm of possibilities. Because this is the scene in which Jesus chases the money changers out of the temple, right? He comes to Jerusalem and sees that all these people are buying and selling in the temple, the significance of which is that the poor who want to come to the temple to offer a sacrifice to God, who want to draw close to God in the temple, are being exploited. Right? It is a money-making scheme that's making money off of people who want to be close to God. And Jesus quite literally flips out. If you read the Gospels, Jesus has some pretty choice words to say for Pharisees and scribes who are trying to keep people and God apart. And by choice words, I mean, like, one of the things that I always laugh about is the people who seem to think that Jesus was crucified because he was too loving. Nobody crucifies somebody who is meek in the traditional sense of the word, right? Like, milquetoast, passive, cool with anything and everything, a doormat. Nobody crucifies that person. That's exactly who the empires, that's what the empire wants. That is the empire's ideal citizen. Jesus is not that guy. Jesus will chase money changers out of the temple, flip over their tables, chew out the Pharisees, the tax collector, the Pharisees and the scribes, calls them whitewashed tombs at one point, looking clean on the outside, but filled with death and decay on the inside. Right? So, if we agree that Jesus on occasion resists evildoers in his ministry, what can he mean if we're reading, do not resist an evildoer? Everyone okay with the idea that Jesus actually does, historically speaking, resist evildoers here and there?
Yeah.
Okay. So I say we can start finding those passages of Scripture where he's flipping over tables and turning out Pharisees if we need to. But what can he mean if he's saying, do not resist an evildoer? But here again, a little Greek is good to know, and especially the historical use of the Greek word. So the Greek word that is being translated to resist is anthistemi. It literally means to stand against. Right? Do not resist, do not stand against. That's the literal meaning of the word. But historically speaking, that was a term that meant a battle. It meant warfare. Because literally what would happen is you would have your army, and they would have their army, and they'd march towards one another until they would stand against each other, right? You are stopping the advancement of this army by standing against them, literally fighting them, right? That's how you stand against them. You take out your swords and you start hacking each other to bits. Again, this is important to know the historical context of the Greek word, right? Jesus is not saying, do not resist an evildoer in the sense of like, let evildoers do whatever the heck they want. Because clearly Jesus himself did not do that. What Jesus is saying is, do not take out your swords and hack the evildoers to bits. Don't resort to violence or battle in order to stand against an evildoer. Makes sense? So we keep going, and we are told to turn the other cheek, right?
So don't be like the guy in Montana
I'm
and
not going to
assassinate or
story.
kill anybody that claims to be a socialist.
Oh, I know, I did not hear that, have that headline. Is that recent? Is that?
Yeah, just one of the state representatives.
Oh, one of the state representatives?
Yeah.
Said that we should kill anyone who's a socialist? Good.
The Constitution says we should kill anybody
Oh.
that's a socialist.
Well, that's... See, those were those, like, anachronisms that drive... Like, Marxism wasn't a thing when the... Like, there was no such thing, right? It's exactly the same as the people that want to read about homosexuality in the Bible, which was not a term that was coined or a phenomenon that was understood at the time the Bible was written. In the same way, socialism and Marxism, like Karl Marx wasn't born yet when they were putting the Constitution together. But oh well.
So what's the alternative? I mean, if you don't go to war with any then what?
I'm glad you asked, Joe. Let's find out, shall we? Let's find out. What is
Do you
it?
have the scripture?
No.
But that's where we're at. So I'm just still in that same paragraph that I read earlier. We're just going to break this apart one line at a time. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. We covered that. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. So, we often repeat the phrase, turn the other cheek, right? But the text is actually specific about which cheek. Did you catch that? So again, turn the other cheek, that is a passage that I have heard quoted sometimes to basically justify encouraging women to stay in abusive relationships. I mean, there are pastors historically who have done that, who are still doing that, who will say, you know, I mean, yeah, your guy might have roughed you up, but the Bible says turn the other cheek. That is not what this is about. If you come away with any lesson, right, it's that what we are talking about here is not passive, to use your excellent word, but active.
So turn the right cheek.
If somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn and offer the other also. Here is the trick. If somebody's going to punch you, Elizabeth, I'm punching you. What cheek did I just strike? The left cheek. If I'm striking you with my fist, what cheek am I going to hit? Lois, I'm striking you. Where am I hitting? Right? I mean, we can mime this one out if you want to. Shelley, here I am, right cheek, right?
And I go this way.
Right. So look at this. If I'm trying to strike her right cheek with my fist, that just doesn't work, right? I'm glancing, right? I'm sliding along the side of it. If I'm going for impact, if I'm trying to punch somebody with my right hand, where's that blow going to land? The left cheek. But Jesus says if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, and just so you know, I think we've covered this in Bible study before, but you all understand that the left hand is a no-no, even if you're left-handed, right? That's where we get the word sinister from.
Of course, to be right-handed.
Yeah, whether you were born left-handed or not, you learn to use your right hand. Nobody would, this is taboo. In fact, we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that even if you point at something with your left hand, just to point something out, you were supposed to do 10 days penance for that. This is super taboo. Historically speaking, this is the hand of cleanliness, and this is the hand of uncleanliness. Martha knows where I'm going with this, because she's seen my top 10 coolest Bible verses presentation. The hand of cleanliness, right? You remember, holiness and cleanliness is a big deal in ancient Judaism. The hand of unholiness and uncleanliness. Toilet paper has not been invented yet. The hand of cleanliness and the hand of uncleanliness. Right? You don't do anything with your left hand. So somebody has to be using their right hand. Has to be using their right hand. But we're told they're being struck on the right cheek. How do you strike somebody on the right cheek using your right hand? Figure it out. Do a little Tetris puzzle. Let's keep this not abusive. You try to figure out how to strike his right cheek with your right hand.
Well, I need to stand on the other side of him.
Oh, that, I was going to say backhand, that's the only way I'm doing it.
If you come like this with your right hand, if you go this direction, then it's very possible to strike somebody on the right cheek with your right hand. Not like this. This doesn't work. This brings you to the left cheek, right? Even if it's an open palm slap. The only good way to get somebody's right cheek with your right hand is a backhand. Jesus is talking about a very specific blow. As I've written here, we are dealing with an insult, not a fist fight. Right? When do people backhand somebody? It's a sign of contempt, right? It's what masters do to their slaves. It's what, parents who are inclined to do this sort of thing will do with their children. Right? It is a put you in your place move. The intention is not to injure, but to humiliate, to put somebody in their place. That's what you use a backhand for. So why does Jesus counsel these already humiliated people to turn the other cheek? Because this action robs the oppressor of their power to humiliate. Right? This is not passive, walk all over you. This is a way for the person who is being backhanded to basically say, despite your... think about historically where this would be used. This would be masters hitting slaves. This would be Roman soldiers hitting Jews. Right? This would be in a situation where there is a power imbalance. To get back to the Revelations thing, this is what the oppressor does to the oppressed. This is what empire does to those who have been conquered. This is for the powerful to do to the powerless, to humiliate them and to show them that they just need to shape up, right? Put you in your place, move. By turning the other cheek, the person who has been struck is in effect saying, you have failed to cow me. You have failed to put me in my place. They're not striking back, right? Because striking back, I mean, that's suicide. The Jew who punches the Roman soldier back is gonna end up where Jesus ended up. The slave who returns a blow from their master is going to be killed. But by turning the other cheek, it's a way of saying to the oppressor, you might have hit me, but you missed. Like that backhand did not have the intended effect. I am not humiliated. I am not going to be dehumanized in this way, right? It's a way to maintain their dignity despite this blow designed to humiliate. If that seems like a novel interpretation of this passage, we're going to keep going through this paragraph, and I hope to show you like this is a theme that just keeps going here. So we read Matthew 5, verse 40. Where did I go? Here we go. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. So if we read Deuteronomy 24, through 13. When you make your neighbor a loan of any kind, you shall not go into the house to take the pledge. You shall wait outside while the person to whom you are making the loan brings the pledge to you. The pledge is your collateral, right? If the person is poor, you shall not sleep in the garment given to you as the pledge. You shall give the pledge back by sunset, so that your neighbor may sleep in the cloak and bless you. And it will be to your credit before the Lord your God. But according to Deuteronomy 24, 10 through 13, somebody who made a loan to a poor person could take their coat, their outer robe, as a form of collateral, as a way of ensuring that you pay the loan back. But they're supposed to return that cloak to you in the evenings so that you have something to sleep in. Right? That's how you also stay warm. So this is a practice, right? If you have loaned somebody money, you can take their outer coat. What's going on is we're referring to a situation in which somebody is taking you to court over an unpaid loan. They're saying, hey, I've lent this guy money, he's not paid it back, so I want my collateral as a way to make him pay me back, right? It says, if you give him your coat, give him your cloak as well. So Jesus is saying, don't just give him the long outer robe, which is the collateral that he's entitled to. Give him the under robe as well. Give him not the outer cloak, but the tunic, the garment that you would wear as your clothing. In other words, Jesus is saying, if somebody takes your outer clothes, give him your inner clothes. Give him all your clothes. Why would you get naked in a courtroom? Historically, nakedness is taboo in Judaism, but the shame is not on the naked person. The shame is on the person who sees the naked person. And if you want some evidence of that, you remember the story of Noah when he got drunk after the ark finally landed? Anybody remember this story? Joe remembers the story. Just so we're all on the same page, if you flip to Genesis 9. So Noah's had a pretty hard few months, right? He spent an awful lot of time on a boat with some animals. It was not a pleasant experience for Noah. And so, when he lands back on his boat, he plants himself a vineyard and makes himself some wine. It says, Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. Noah passed out naked. Too much to drink. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed by the Lord, my God, be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. And may God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. There we go. It's like, it's an awful big deal that Ham saw his father naked. His brothers, by contrast, carefully walk this blanket, this cloak in backwards and lay it across Noah's nose. Right? The shame is not on the person who is naked. Right? I mean, in our society, in our understanding, we might be like, hey Noah, you may have a problem. Like, it is not ideal for you to drink so much that you pass out naked. Right? That in our culture, we pretty much put the shame on Noah, right? Like, you did what, dude? Like, get that under control. Drinking so much you pass out naked. But in this culture, it's not that Noah's passed out naked, right? Nobody's given Noah any grief for this. It's the brother who sees him naked that gets the shame. So Jesus is saying, if somebody sues you, and why? From Deuteronomy, we know why somebody sues you to take your cloak. Because of debt. In other words, this is a problem that poor people will find themselves in. This is not a problem that a rich person is ever going to have to deal with. A rich person is never going to be taken to court to get their cloak, that long outer robe. Jesus is saying to these poor people, if somebody sues you to take your cloak, the outer garment, give him the undergarment as well. And in doing so, the debtor brings shame on the creditor. The poor person brings shame upon the wealthy person who is, and you know, life hasn't changed that much. It's loan sharking type stuff. I mean, we're talking about like 50%, 100% interest rates, like crazy high, like the credit card companies today. This is a way for people who are supposed to be shamed by their poverty to flip it around and bring shame on those who are keeping them in poverty. It's guerrilla theater, right? It's making a pretty big public statement when you start walking out of the courtroom, you know, butt naked. It's a political statement. The person who is supposed to be shamed because of their poverty flips the script, does this sort of nonviolent resistance jujitsu, and instead of being shamed, shames the creditor, the one who is charging these ridiculous interest rates so that they can become wealthy at the expense of others. Speaking of jujitsu, here's our next passage. Our next line. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. This is referring to a very specific situation that occurred in the Roman Empire. If you were an officer in the Roman Empire, if you were a commander, you would have slaves and animals that would carry your gear for you. But if you were just a soldier, you know, just one more soldier in the Roman legion, you had to carry all your own stuff. You had to carry your weapons, your armor, your sleeping bag, your tent, all your gear, anything that you would take with you as a soldier, you had to carry that on yourself. And so, what they would do, and this wasn't just the Romans that did it. In fact, the Romans were kind of enlightened in that they limited it to a mile. But what they would do is if they saw some person on the street, like they're going through town, and there's somebody on the street, they can point to that person and say, hey, you need to come carry my gear for me. It was a way for the Roman soldier to get a break. Didn't have to carry his gear for a mile. That was the law. So that you could impress servitude on anybody you see, right? Anybody who happens to be in your path, you can force them to carry your gear to get yourself a break for a mile. In fact, we have an example of that in the story where Jesus is on his way to be crucified, right? He cannot carry his cross because he's been beaten so severely that he is unable to physically carry his cross. And so this man, Simon of Cyrene, there's a Roman soldier who just says, hey, you're going to carry this cross for this guy. Because I got places to be, and I'm sure not going to carry it myself, right? Soldier doesn't want to carry the cross. He forces somebody else to do it. But the law of Rome was that you could only make them carry it for a mile. Because otherwise, it was just too disruptive, right? I mean, you can't make somebody walk 10 miles outside of town. I mean, the reality is that these people are still what drives your economy. This is where your Roman taxes come from. You have to eventually let them get back to their day, to making what they make, growing what they grow, doing what they do, so that they have taxes to pay to you. And so that was the rule. A Roman soldier could make anybody carry their gear, but only for 1 mile. So we talk about jujitsu, right? Flipping things around. Imagine this scenario in which a Roman soldier has forced somebody to carry their gear for a mile. His mile is up. He knows he has to take his gear back now. It's military code, right? It is a law for the military. He has to take his gear back. And so he's like, all right, it's time to take my gear back. I guess I have to. And here's this smiling Jewish peasant like, no, buddy, it's all right. I got it for 1 more mile. What? Wait, what? What do you do with that? Because here's the thing. If you take him up on his offer, which, I mean, deep down, you kind of want to, because that means that's 1 more mile. You don't have to carry your pack. But if you take him up on his offer, you are violating Roman military code. If you have learned anything from our study of Revelations of the historical Roman Empire, you can imagine what the punishment is for soldiers who violate the military code, right? It is not a write-up and a talk with your supervisor. It involves not eating for days, or being whipped with whips, or both, right? It is not. So what do you do with this now? What do you do with this Jewish peasant who's smiling and enthusiastically wants to carry your pack for 1 more mile? Right? Again, it's a way to do this sort of jujitsu move, to flip the script, right? To say that the oppressor is not going to get to be the oppressor. Because you're now putting this Roman soldier in the awkward situation of having to ask for his pack back. Right? He is having to ask this Jewish man, please, sir, I really insist that you give me my pack back and let me carry it. Right? It is a complete reversal of the social order. A complete reversal of this oppressive relationship. Please, sir, can I have my gear back?
So authority has to ask the oppressed.
Right. The person who is the authority, the oppressor has to ask the oppressed person to get it back, right? It's jujitsu. It's flip the script. Now there's a reason why Jesus rattles off 3 examples. Because the reality is that these are 3 examples. right? Doing that the first time, right? The first time somebody asks the Roman soldier to go a second mile and totally discombobulates the Roman soldier and flips the script, you can do that for a while and have the desired effect. But at some point, the Roman army gets wise to this and there's a crackdown, right? You can strip yourself naked in the courtroom to make a statement, but eventually that statement starts to lose its impact. Right? Jesus is rattling off examples of nonviolent resistance here in order to encourage these people to, oh, it must be electric time, they're still here.
I guess so.
All right. In order to encourage his disciples, in order to encourage his followers to start thinking this way, it's important to point out, none of these is passive, right? Every single one of these things is active. It is an action for somebody to take in order to stand up to oppression, in order to stand up to the people who have the power by the people who have no power, right? It's a way for poor people to stand up to the rich who are making these exploitative loans. It's a way for a conquered people to stand up for their oppressive conquerors. Right? It's a way for the slaves and the Jews, and I mean historically, right, it would be children and parents, it would be husbands and wives, right? I mean, you go to jail if you backhand your wife now, but that was par for the course at the time that Jesus is explaining this, right? It is a way for people who lack power to actively stand up to people who have power in moments of oppression, in situations where they are being oppressed. What do you all think of that? With the exception perhaps of Joe, who read the book that I offered him. Has anybody ever presented this stuff to you
No,
before?
this is like very close.
If you don't know the history of this stuff, all that you hear in this passage is Jesus saying, whatever abuse somebody heaps on you, go ahead and keep taking more abuse. Right? I mean, that's, I think, a fairly standard way to interpret this passage. Whatever abuse is being heaped on you, just go ahead and keep taking more abuse. What Jesus is actually saying here is the opposite.
So people are thinking the completely wrong thing when they first read this.
This is one of the reasons why I think Bible study is so important, right? It's historical context matters, right? If you don't know that it's Roman soldiers asking Jewish peasants to carry their gear for 1 mile, then you don't understand the power dynamic that's at play there, right? If you don't read Deuteronomy 24 to know that when somebody's suing you for your coat, that's only something that you do with debtors, right? That's the situation that we're talking about, is debt.
And the reality is that anything else is misuse of blood, which we have done historically.
Well, and that's the part that really...
It's been weaponized.
It absolutely can be weaponized, right? Like there are those who don't know the historical context, and so they read this passage and they just assume that it means, right, if you're taking abuse, go ahead and take more abuse. But there are people who know the historical context and nevertheless intentionally present this passage as, if you're taking abuse, if abuse is being heaped on you, go ahead and take more abuse. And that's how the empire wants you to read it, right? That's how the oppressor wants you to read it. The oppressor wants, if you're being abused, take more abuse. But what's actually going on here is, if you are being abused, find a way to stand up to the abuser. Find a way to take your power back. Find a way to flip the script. But do it non-violently. Right? It's not. I mean, and there were those folks. In fact, I I'd have to find the Bible verse, and I should have prepared for this, but I didn't know I'd be saying it until just this moment. Judas Iscariot, famously the man who betrays Jesus, is referred to at one place in the Bible as Judas the Zealot. Zealots are a particular political movement within Israel, within Palestine, that tried to overthrow the Roman conquerors using violence. And there are some Bible commentators who have suggested that that's the reason why Judas ultimately betrays Jesus, is because Judas is unsatisfied with Jesus' methods. Judas sees Jesus doing this whole nonviolent resistance thing and thinks,
You're supposed to have been kicking some butt.
right, that's the Messiah. The Messiah is the guy who rallies the army and drives out the Romans. Judas wants that Messiah. I'm sure you've heard that in church before, right? That the more traditional understanding of the role of the Messiah in historical Judaism was that the Messiah would be a great conqueror, a great king, a guy who comes along and just beats up the Romans and chases them away. And Judas sees all this non-violent resistance, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, find a way to take your power back but do it without killing Romans. And he is unsatisfied with Jesus' methods. He thinks Jesus is taking too long, and he'd much rather see Jesus get some swords in some people's hands. So, we keep going with this famous passage that I just referred to earlier, starting at verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Now this is starting to make some more sense, hopefully, once we put these passages into context, right? This is not Jesus saying, when people are abusing you, go ahead and take more abuse. But it's a way of saying to pray for your enemies, which Jesus himself famously did. Luke 23:34. Anybody know it without looking? Can you guess from context? Jesus famously prayed for those who persecuted him.
Oh, forgive them when he's on the cross.
Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what it is that they are doing. Right? Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what it is that they are doing. That is the premise of nonviolent resistance. They don't know what they're doing. The approach of nonviolent resistance assumes that these oppressive situations are harmful for the oppressor as well as the oppressed. In the situation of empire, there is no such thing as a winner. In the situation of slavery in this country, there was no such thing as a winner. Because for the Africans, the slaves, right, the abuse is clear, right? I mean, it's physical abuse, it's sexual abuse, it's being treated as property, it's a total destruction of family life. It's obvious how they're losing out in this situation, but it is also harmful in a different way for the slaveholders, because they have to start viewing their fellow human beings as not human, because they have to start being quick to violence. They have to get to a place where their head and their heart are good with beating somebody, even beating somebody to death. What does that do to your soul? When you've reached a point where you can beat another person to death. There are no winners in these situations. That's the premise of nonviolent resistance, is that we are not just out to save the oppressed, but we are out to save the oppressors from themselves, because they don't realize what it is that they're doing. Father, forgive them, because they don't realize what it is that they're doing.
I mean, it's also something, and you've heard this before from me, it's something used by our military. I mean, it has to be. And this in no way is against anything, like against veterans or anything else. But I could not have done what I did in Vietnam had the government not taken the face off the enemy. They were gooks. They were slant eyes. Yeah, they were not people.
Yeah.
They weren't people. The Arabs, they're not people.
Right.
And the guys that come back, they're not people. They're not, we don't change the programming back.
That's
Yeah.
right.
We don't switch it back. We turn it on, and we don't turn it off. And I coach little girls in soccer, mostly Molly's team because of her abilities, but little girls back then, before Title X, you couldn't make them aggressive. But if you made them aggressive, it was hard to stop. I mean, it's just, so how do you balance things? And we do the same thing. We take the face off people. You can't hate somebody
Right.
unless you take the face off. That they're not
Right.
worthy.
And when we dehumanize others, we lose some of our own humanity.
And that's the truth.
And that's the premise of nonviolent resistance, right? Is that we are out to save everybody. You are out to save the oppressed, but you're also out to save the oppressors from themselves. Because when we dehumanize others, we lose some of our own humanity. Right? Nonviolent resistance is not about winning a battle, it's about winning over hearts and minds.
No, I
That's
got
how
one more
victory
thing.
is defined. And one of my all-time favorite lines is that violent revolutions change the rulers, but not the rules. I mean, you look when, historically, when there have been violent revolutions to overthrow governments in our world, right? I mean, you think about the communist revolutions in South America, in Stalin's Russia. Right? Very often when somebody says, like, we are oppressed, you're treating us badly, so we're going to rally our forces, we're going to get some guns, we're going to kill all the people who've been oppressing us.
Look at the Civil War. Changed the rulers. It didn't change the rules.
Right.
Not really.
Right.
I mean, you went from slavery to Jim Crow, but it didn't change the rules.
Right.
The rules were essentially the same.
I mean, you think about those violent revolutions historically around our world. How long does it take before those people who had instigated a revolution in order to set people free, in order to liberate them, themselves become autocratic dictators who will use violence to stay in power, right? The problem with violent revolutions is you end up being governed by killers. And just like you said, once you flip that switch, it's really hard to flip it back the other way, right? Once you have decided that violence is justified in your revolution, well, then violence is justified in maintaining your revolution. Violence is justified in maintaining your position at the top of this government. And if anybody tries to challenge you as the governor, as the president, or the general, or the dictator, or whatever the title is in that particular country, right? If violence was justified in getting you into that position, then violence is justified in keeping you in that position. And before too long, you got Middle East. I mean, you can think of a million examples of this, right? People who came to power on the promise of liberation, who very quickly themselves become dictators. Right? So, one last passage that we're really going to look at is Romans 12:17 through 21. starting in verse 17. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That last line in particular, I mean, that's just exactly what Dr. King said, right? Hate cannot overcome hate, only love can do that. So as we start breaking this down, in verse 17 it says, do not repay anyone evil for evil. I do want to point out that the Greek word being translated as evil there is kekos, which can be translated as evil, but it can also be translated as harm. Right? This could just have easily have been translated, do not repay anyone harm for harm. Sort of the old, do not repay anyone eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Do not repay anyone harm for harm. In fact, I would suggest that that might be a better translation just because it seems redundant if we keep it as do not repay anyone for evil, evil for evil, and then later say, what was the line there? I lost my page. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Right? Overcome evil with good and do not repay evil for evil almost seem redundant, but if you say do not repay harm for harm, it's a little less redundant. But either way, the meaning is pretty clear. This passage about heaping burning coals on their head, mine is in quotes. Is anybody else's in quotes? Starting with, if your enemies are hungry, there's little quotation marks in mine.
Yeah.
So that's because Paul, who was the author of Romans, Paul is quoting Proverbs 25:22. That's that right there, where it starts with saying, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to eat. For by doing this, you will keep burning coals on their head. That piece that's in quotation marks is Proverbs 25:22. We don't need to flip there unless you don't believe me, but because you just read it, that's Proverbs 25:22. That's what Paul is quoting here. This is not an invitation to literally hurt them or literally harm them. Obviously, I think from the context where we just read, do not repay harm for harm. But it's that same concept about winning is not about winning a battle, but winning over hearts and minds, right? You cause them discomfort about the relationship to somebody that they have been cruel to. Right? If somebody has been cruel to you, and you in turn are kind to them, then that starts making them uncomfortable with their own cruelty. It's we keep coming back to this idea of flipping the script, right? The jujitsu. If somebody is dehumanizing you enough to be cruel to you, then your kindness becomes a way to rehumanize yourself in their eyes. Just to be sure, just to be complete, I'm going to go to Hebrews, 1 Peter 3:9, just to make sure that you know that this is in there. Do not repay anyone evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you were called, that you might inherit a blessing. It's there. It's in the New Testament. You just heard it in Romans. It's repeated later. So like I said, part of the reason that I wanted to share this was because I just really think it's cool that, seriously, as near as I can tell, historically speaking, Jesus of Nazareth came up with the concept of nonviolent resistance. You know, what Dr. King was doing in this country, what Nelson Mandela was doing in South Africa, what Gandhi was doing in India. That's exactly what Jesus is encouraging his followers to do when he says, if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If somebody sues you for your coat, give them your cloak as well. If somebody makes you go a mile, go the second mile. It's a way of standing up to oppression, but doing so in a non-violent way, in an effort to change people's hearts and minds. To have not just a revolution of the rulers, but a revolution of values, right? If it's violent revolution, you have changed the rulers, but not the rules. You haven't changed the values of society. But a non-violent revolution can actually change hearts and minds. Sort of as a last thought, I'm also realistic about the world that we live in. I always find it irresponsible to teach this lesson without mentioning Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you are unfamiliar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he's one of my favorite theologians. He was a Lutheran pastor and theologian living in Germany. He wrote The Cost of Discipleship, which I read that first introductory chapter to that book like a dozen times a year, and it has yet to fail to make me cry a little. It's a fantastic book if you ever get a chance at The Cost of Discipleship. But he was a Lutheran German pastor and theologian, and a vowed pacifist. He was a part of this sort of, well, it wasn't the Anabaptists themselves because he came later, but this belief that in order to reclaim the integrity of the early Christian church, that a Christian never should use violence under any circumstances. And then Hitler came along. That was, Bonhoeffer was writing The Cost of Discipleship in the 1930s as Hitler was rising to power. And eventually Bonhoeffer reached the point where he actually joined in a plot to assassinate Hitler. And it's really interesting. He was arrested and he ended up being killed in a German concentration camp just weeks before the Allies came and liberated it. But he was in the camp, and we have some of his letters and writings from that time. And he makes it clear that he doesn't think that the violence that he planned to use was something that was good in the eyes of God. He says, I'm hoping that God will forgive me for this attempt. But he also was like, just looking at the reality of what Nazi Germany was doing and felt like he had no other choice.
Just evil personified.
Right. This is to say two things. One of which is that obviously with nonviolent resistance, I mean, look at the history of those people that I listed off, right? What Gandhi was doing, what Nelson Mandela was doing, what Dr. King was doing. Nonviolent resistance is a commitment to having the wrath of the oppressors brought down on you.
It's costly.
It is costly. It is not an easy path. All of those men that I mentioned spent a fair share of time in prison. Dr. King was assassinated. Gandhi was assassinated. It is a path that inherently involves self-sacrifice. In this respect, it's not surprising that it's the path that Jesus chose. Because that's also that's where Jesus ended up, was on the cross. So, it's important to count the costs when we talk about nonviolent resistance, because they're real. And it's also important to remember the example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That there probably have been those moments in history, right? I, in a very joking way, when we were talking about Revelations and how there are these sort of two eschatological models, right? Does the present age come to an end and the new age come in through a prophetic way, in which the preaching of the Word of God eventually changes everybody's hearts and minds and just ushers in a new age? Or does it have to come in through the apocalyptic way, where God shows up with the armies of angels with flaming swords and bowls full of wrath are dumped out, and the only way to finally get the world purified is for God to come in and just kill all the evil people. And that's the apocalyptic model. That's the one Revelations goes with. You read Isaiah, Isaiah has a little different framework.
But still, it's Revelations, that study of Revelations has made it my current reading of Isaiah, and I'm finally in the third Isaiah, but let's see, all things are
Right.
kind of.
They'll get better, yeah.
I'm just gonna,
Yeah.
I mean, make it, having done what we did with Revelations, makes it easier for somebody to read Isaiah. I mean, to make sense of it.
Right. Right. Yeah, a lot of that language in Revelations comes from Isaiah.
Kind of the same.
And again, right, there's that corollary between empire and empire, right? Babylon in one and Rome in the other, but there's the... So, all this is to say that I don't pass judgment on the decision to use violence when it seems to be, I mean, Bonhoeffer went to assassinate Hitler. He was going to murder him because he thought it was for the greater good. But I think that the Christian calling is at a minimum to first and foremost pursue methods of nonviolence.
But I also think it's very important to say, no matter what we have to do, so you have to be pragmatic about it, but violence begets violence.
I mean, that's the reality. Right? The reality is that violence begets violence.
It's not going to stop violence.
Violence changes the rulers, but not the rules. Sometimes the ruler has gotten so bad that it's hard to imagine an alternative, right? With folks like Hitler. I don't know. These are those things that weigh heavy on me. Where Jesus asks a lot of us. If you get nothing else from the Bible, get that Jesus asks a lot of us. I love there's a G.K. Chesterton quote that I have repeated often. It is not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. It's that Christianity has been found difficult and not tried. It's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. It's that Christianity has been found difficult and not tried. You read the history of the early church where everybody sold all their possessions in order to give them to the poor. Jesus asks a lot of us. And I think it's important that we're gracious with ourselves and that we do what we can where we can, but Jesus asks a lot